Hello, welcome to Blacktop Files. Tonight we bring you a collection of accounts from the Quinault Rain Forest, where the oldest trees in North America stand witness to things that don't belong in any field guide or forestry manual. This is a channel dedicated to long-form horror stories that feel like true accounts from across the United States, grounded in the kind of detail that makes you check your locks twice and think about places you've been that felt just a little bit wrong. The Quinault Rain Forest sits on Washington's Olympic Peninsula, a stretch of temperate rainforest so dense and wet that moss grows on moss, where the canopy above can block out the sky entirely, and where fog rolls in off the Pacific and settles between the trunks like something alive. The people who work there, the rangers and trail maintenance crews, and research biologists, will tell you it's one of the most beautiful places on Earth. But they'll also tell you, if you catch them at the right time, that beauty has a way of hiding things. The forest is old, older than the roads that cut through it, older than the towns that cling to its edges, older than the logic we use to explain away what we see in the periphery when the light starts to fail. What makes these particular cases disturbing is the consistency. Different people, different years, different reasons for being out there, but the same wrongness showing up again and again in their reports. The same sense that the forest was watching, the same realization that they were alone in a place that was anything but empty. If you want more horror that feels uncomfortably real, make sure to subscribe to Blacktop Files, turn on notifications so you never miss a file, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Whether that's a city apartment or somewhere a little closer to the trees. Let's begin with a ranger who thought he understood the boundaries of his district until one winter taught him otherwise. I'd been working for the Forest Service in the Quinault district for almost 6 years when it happened. That's long enough to know the trails, the campsites, the problem spots where hikers get turned around or underestimate the weather. Long enough to stop thinking of the forest as a place that could surprise me. I was wrong about that. It was late February, middle of the week, and the rain had been coming down for 3 days straight. Not the light drizzle that's constant out here, but heavy, cold sheets that turned every trail into a mudslick and every creek into something you had to respect. We'd closed most of the recreational areas. No one was camping, no one was hiking. It was just me and 2 other rangers covering a district that stretched across thousands of acres of old growth in secondary forest, checking for washouts and downed trees, making sure the roads were still passable. I was assigned the Northern Loop, a service road that runs parallel to the Quinault River before cutting back inland through a section of forest that hasn't been logged in over a century. The trees there are massive, Sitka spruce and western red cedar, some of them 30 feet around at the base, their roots spreading out like the fingers of a half-buried hand. The canopy is so thick that even in full daylight, it feels like dusk underneath. And when the fog comes in, which it does almost every morning, you can't see more than 20 or 30 feet in any direction. I'd driven that road 100 times. I knew every turnout, every landmark, but that morning, about an hour into my patrol, I saw something I didn't recognize. It was a cairn, a stack of stones, maybe 4 feet high, sitting just off the shoulder of the road where the forest started. The stones were dark and wet, river rock mostly, stacked with enough care that it was clearly deliberate. I stopped the truck and got out, leaving the engine running. The rain was lighter by then, more of a mist, and the forest was absolutely silent except for the occasional drip of water from the branches above. I walked over to the cairn and crouched down next to it. The stones were cold and slick, and there was no obvious reason for it to be there. It wasn't a trail marker. It wasn't on any of our maps. It looked old, the kind of thing that might have been standing for years. But I'd driven past that exact spot dozens of times and never noticed it before. I stood up and looked into the forest. The undergrowth was dense, sword ferns and salal and thick mats of moss covering everything. But there was a gap in the vegetation just beyond the cairn, almost like the start of a trail. I couldn't see far, maybe 10 feet before the fog and the trees swallowed everything, but it looked navigable, deliberate. I should have left it alone, should have noted the location, taken a photo, and moved on. But something about it bothered me. The fact that it was new, or at least new to me. The fact that it was so clearly intentional and yet so out of place. I grabbed my radio and my pack from the truck and started into the trees. The ground was soft, covered in a thick layer of decomposing needles and leaves, and my boots sank an inch or two with every step. The air smelled like wet bark and earth, that deep, green smell you only get in a rainforest. The gap I'd seen from the road did turn into a kind of trail, though it wasn't maintained. Just a narrow corridor through the undergrowth, winding between the massive trunks. I followed it for maybe 200 yards, marking my route mentally by the shapes of the trees and the angle of the slope. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no squirrels, no sound of wind in the branches. Just the soft patter of rain and the occasional creak of wood. That's when I saw the second cairn. It was smaller than the first, maybe 2 feet high, sitting at the base of a Sitka spruce that had to be at least 500 years old. The stones were arranged in the same deliberate way, and there was something placed on top of the stack. I got closer and realized it was a piece of bone. Not large, maybe 6 inches long, white and smooth, like it had been weathered for a long time. I didn't touch it. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the forest. The fog had thickened, and I could barely see 30 feet in any direction. The trees seemed to close in, their trunks dark and massive, their branches draped with moss that hung down like curtains. I pulled out my radio and tried to raise the station, but all I got was static. That wasn't unusual. The canopy out here plays hell with radio signals, especially in the deep sections. I should have turned back. I know that now. But I kept thinking about the cairns, about the bone, about the trail that seemed to lead somewhere specific. I told myself I'd follow it just a little farther, just to see where it went. And then I'd head back to the truck and file a report. The trail curved to the left, following the contour of a hill, and after another 100 yards, I came to a clearing. It wasn't large, maybe 40 feet across, and it was perfectly circular. The trees around it were enormous, their trunks forming a rough perimeter, and the ground inside the circle was bare. No undergrowth, no ferns, no moss, just dark, wet earth. In the center of the clearing was a third cairn. This one was different. It was taller, maybe 6 feet, and the stones were larger, more irregular. And there were things woven between the stones. Thin branches, stripped of their bark, twisted together in patterns that didn't make sense. They almost looked like symbols, but not any kind I recognized. I stood at the edge of the clearing and stared at the cairn. The silence felt heavier here, like the forest was holding its breath. The rain had stopped completely, though I could still hear it falling somewhere in the distance beyond the trees. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough that I started to feel cold, deep cold that seeped through my jacket and settled into my chest. Long enough that I started to notice details I hadn't seen before. The way the bare earth in the clearing seemed undisturbed, as if nothing had ever walked across it. The way the twisted branches between the stones seemed to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them, like they were moving on their own. That's when I heard the sound. It came from somewhere behind me, back in the direction I'd come from. A low rhythmic tapping, like wood striking wood, slow and deliberate. 3 taps, then a pause. 3 more taps. I turned and looked into the forest, but I couldn't see anything. The fog was too thick, the trees too dense. The tapping stopped. I waited, listening. My heart was pounding, and I could feel sweat starting to bead on my forehead despite the cold. I pulled out my flashlight and swept the beam across the trees, but all I saw was bark and moss and shadow. The tapping started again, closer this time. 3 taps, pause. 3 taps, pause. It was coming from the left now, somewhere off to the side of the trail I'd followed. I backed toward the clearing, keeping my light trained on the forest. The tapping moved again, circling around me, always just out of sight. It felt deliberate, like whatever was making the sound was tracking me, staying just far enough away that I couldn't see it, but close enough that I knew it was there. I turned and started walking quickly back the way I'd come, following my own footprints in the soft ground. The tapping followed me. It stayed parallel, moving through the trees, matching my pace. I started to jog, then to run, stumbling over roots and ferns, my breath coming hard and fast. The forest seemed to shift around me. Trees I didn't remember, slopes that felt wrong, gaps in the undergrowth that shouldn't have been there. I kept thinking I should be back at the road by now, that I'd only walked a few hundred yards, but the trail kept going, winding and turning, and the tapping kept following. I don't know how long I ran, long enough that my legs started to shake, that my lungs burned, that I started to think I'd gotten completely turned around and would never find my way out. And then suddenly, I saw light ahead, pale gray light filtering through the trees. I burst out onto the service road about 50 yards from where I'd parked the truck. I stood there, gasping, my hands on my knees, and looked back at the forest. The tapping had stopped. The fog had pulled back slightly, and I could see the trees standing silent and still, their branches dripping with rain. The cairn was gone. I walked back to the spot where I'd seen it, right there on the shoulder of the road, and there was nothing. No stones, no gap in the undergrowth, no sign that anything had ever been there. I got in the truck and sat there for a long time, hands shaking, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Eventually, I radioed the station and told them I was finishing the patrol and heading back. I didn't mention the cairns or the clearing or the tapping. I didn't know how to explain it in a way that wouldn't make me sound like I'd lost my mind. I went back a week later with another ranger, a guy who'd been working the district even longer than I had. I told him I wanted to check something, and I took him to the spot where I'd seen the first cairn. We walked into the forest, following the route I remembered, but there was no trail, just thick undergrowth and trees and moss. No cairns, no clearing, no bare earth. He asked me what I was looking for, and I told him I must have been mistaken. We went back to the truck, and that was the end of it. But I still think about it. About the cairns and the bone and the tapping that followed me through the trees. About the way the forest seemed to shift and change, like it didn't want me to find my way out. I still patrol that road, but I don't stop anymore. I don't look too closely at the forest on either side. And when I see something that doesn't quite fit, some detail that seems out of place, I keep driving. The next account comes from a biologist who spent an entire season studying the old-growth stands and learned that some patterns in nature don't fit into any research model. I was part of a team studying canopy ecosystems in the Quinault Rain Forest during the summer and fall. The project was supposed to run for 6 months, collecting data on epiphyte diversity and nutrient cycling in old-growth Sitka spruce. It was good work, the kind of fieldwork I'd been training for, and the Quinault was one of the best sites in the Pacific Northwest for that kind of research. There were 4 of us on the team, rotating through different sections of the forest, setting up monitoring stations and collecting samples. My area was a tract of old growth, about 3 miles from the ranger station, accessible by a logging road that hadn't been used in decades. The trees there were some of the largest I'd ever worked with, and the canopy structure was incredibly complex. Layers upon layers of moss and lichen and ferns growing on the branches 100 feet above the ground. I usually worked alone. The others had their own sections, and we'd meet back at the station in the evenings to compare notes and upload data. I didn't mind the solitude. The forest was beautiful and the work was absorbing, and I'd gotten used to the constant rain and the wet and the feeling of being very small underneath those massive trees. It was early October when I started noticing the markers. They were small, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Little stacks of twigs, arranged in tight spirals, and left on the trunks of trees or balanced on exposed roots. I thought at first they were debris, maybe something left behind by the wind, but the more I saw them, the more deliberate they seemed. Each one was carefully constructed, the twigs woven together in a pattern that was too precise to be accidental. I photographed a few of them and mentioned it to the team that evening. No one else had seen anything similar in their sections. One of the other researchers suggested it might be territorial markers left by another research group, but we checked and there was no one else working that area. Another theory was that they were some kind of wildlife sign, maybe constructed by ravens or crows, but the pattern was too consistent, too intentional. I started keeping track of where I found them. Over the next 2 weeks, I documented more than 30 markers scattered throughout my study area. They seemed to form a rough perimeter, a wide circle that enclosed about 2 square miles of forest. The circle overlapped with several of my monitoring stations, so I was crossing through it multiple times a day. The forest inside the perimeter started to feel different. It's hard to describe. The light seemed dimmer, even on the rare clear days when the sun broke through. The air felt heavier, damp, in a way that went beyond the normal humidity of a rainforest, and the silence was more pronounced. I'd gotten used to the background noise of the forest, the drip of water and the rustle of small animals, and the occasional call of a bird. But inside the perimeter, all of that seemed muted, distant, like I was hearing it through a layer of cotton. I told myself it was psychological, that I was spending too much time alone, that the isolation and the repetitive work were starting to mess with my head. But the feeling persisted, and it got stronger the deeper I went into the perimeter. In late October, I found the first altered tree. It was a western red cedar, maybe 15 feet in diameter, standing near the center of the perimeter. The bark had been stripped away in a vertical line from the base to about 8 feet up, exposing the pale wood underneath. The stripped section was about a foot wide, and it looked fresh. The edges of the bark were clean, not ragged, like they'd been cut with a tool. I examined it closely, looking for saw marks or axe cuts, but the wood was smooth. There were shallow grooves running along the stripped section, parallel lines that looked almost like they'd been made by fingernails. I photographed it and measured it and added it to my notes, but I didn't have an explanation. Over the next week, I found 3 more altered trees, all of them within the perimeter, all of them stripped in the same way. The grooves were always present, always parallel, always running vertically along the exposed wood. I started avoiding the center of the perimeter. I rerouted my daily transects to stay closer to the edges, checking my monitoring stations as quickly as possible, and then moving on. The feeling of being watched had become constant. Not paranoia, not exactly. Just the awareness that something was paying attention, that I was moving through a space that wasn't empty. It was early November, just after the first serious storm of the season, when I saw the EEO figure. I was working near one of the altered trees, collecting lichen samples from a fallen log, when I saw movement in the corner of my eye. I looked up and saw someone standing about 50 feet away, partially obscured by the trunk of a massive spruce. At first I thought it was one of my colleagues, maybe checking in on me or looking for something in my section. But the figure didn't move, didn't call out. It just stood there, perfectly still, and I realized after a moment that something was wrong with the proportions. Too tall, too narrow, the limbs too long. I stood up slowly, my sample bag still in my hand, and stared at the figure. The fog was thick that day, and the light was poor, but I could see enough to know that it wasn't human. The shape was wrong. The way it stood was wrong, and it was watching me. I don't remember deciding to run. I just remember dropping the bag and moving, crashing through the undergrowth, heading for the logging road as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I ran until I reached my truck, threw my gear in the back, and drove straight to the ranger station. I didn't tell the team what I'd seen. I told them I wasn't feeling well, that I needed a few days off. They were understanding. I drove back to town and spent the next 3 days in my motel room, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it, that the isolation and the strange markers and the altered trees had combined to create a hallucination. But I couldn't shake the image, the way the figure had stood, motionless and watching, the wrongness of its shape. I went back to the forest a week later, but I didn't go into the perimeter. I collected my monitoring equipment from the edges and filed my final reports early. The project was winding down anyway, and no one questioned my decision to finish ahead of schedule. I haven't been back to the Quinault since then. I've worked in other forests, other research sites, and I've never seen anything like the markers or the altered trees. I've told myself a dozen different explanations: stress, fatigue, the effects of prolonged isolation. Maybe someone was out there, some squatter or hermit, and I just didn't get a good look. But I still have the photographs. The markers, the stripped bark, the grooves in the wood. And I still remember the way the figure stood, too still and too wrong, watching me from the shadows between the trees. Another file from the same season. This one involving a trail maintenance worker who learned that some paths in the forest don't stay where you left them. I worked trail maintenance for the Olympic National Forest for 3 seasons, and the Quinault was part of my regular rotation. It's steady work, mostly clearing deadfall and brushing back undergrowth, fixing drainage issues, replacing signage. The kind of labor that keeps you outside all day, which was exactly what I wanted. The Quinault trails are popular with tourists during the summer, but by late fall, traffic drops off significantly. Most of my work in October and November was prep for the winter, making sure the trails were safe for the handful of hikers who still came through and marking problem areas that would need attention in the spring. I was assigned to maintain a section of the Colonel Bob Trail, a steep route that climbs up from the Quinault River Valley into the high country. It's a challenging hike, about 7 miles one way, with significant elevation gain, and it passes through some of the densest old growth in the area before breaking into alpine meadows near the summit. I'd been working the lower section of the trail for about 2 weeks, clearing blowdowns and reinforcing the tread where erosion had undercut the path. The work was slow and solitary, and I usually didn't see another person for days at a time. It was mid-November when I noticed the divergence. I was working about 3 miles up from the trailhead, near a section where the path cuts through a grove of old-growth hemlocks. I'd been through that area a dozen times over the previous weeks, and I knew the trail well. But that morning, as I was walking up with my tools, I saw what looked like a fork in the path. It wasn't marked on any of the maps. The main trail continued straight ahead, switchbacking up the slope, but there was a second path branching off to the left, heading deeper into the hemlock grove. It looked maintained, or at least well used. The tread was clear, the undergrowth trimmed back, and there were even a few cairns marking the route. I stopped and stared at it. I'd walked past that exact spot probably 20 times, and I was certain the fork hadn't been there before. I checked my GPS and my map, but there was no indication of any side trail in that location. I decided to follow it, just far enough to see where it went, to figure out if it was an old trail that had been decommissioned, or maybe a bootleg route created by off-trail hikers. The path wound through the hemlocks, descending slightly, and after a few hundred yards, it opened into a small meadow. The meadow was roughly circular, maybe 100 feet across, and it was filled with chest-high ferns that had turned golden with the season. In the center of the meadow was a single standing stone, a tall, narrow piece of basalt that rose about 6 feet out of the ground. I walked over to the stone and examined it. It looked natural, not carved or shaped, but its placement seemed deliberate. The meadow felt too perfect, too symmetrical, like it had been designed rather than formed by chance. I stood there for a while, looking around, trying to decide if I should report the trail and the meadow or just mark it on my map and move on. The air was very still, and the only sound was the faint rustle of the ferns. That's when I realized the trail I'd followed into the meadow was gone. I turned around and looked at the tree line. There was no gap, no path, no indication of how I'd entered. The hemlocks stood close together, their trunks dark and covered in moss, and the undergrowth between them was thick and undisturbed. I walked to the edge of the meadow, to the spot where I thought I'd come through, and pushed into the ferns and salal looking for the trail. There was nothing, just dense forest, impassable without cutting. I pulled out my GPS and checked my position. According to the device, I was about a quarter mile off the main trail, deeper into the forest than I should have been. But the path I'd followed had been clear and well-defined, and I hadn't walked that far. I tried to retrace my steps, using the GPS to navigate back toward the main trail, but the terrain didn't match what I remembered. The slope was wrong, the trees were different, and after 20 minutes of bushwhacking, I still hadn't found the path. I stopped and took a breath, trying to stay calm. I had my GPS, I had my map, and I had enough daylight to find my way back to the trailhead if I needed to. But something about the situation felt deeply wrong. The meadow, the standing stone, the way the trail had simply vanished. I decided to head due east, straight toward where the main trail should have been according to my GPS. I pushed through the undergrowth, climbing over fallen logs and wading through ferns, and after another 15 minutes, I finally saw the trail, but it wasn't where it was supposed to be. According to my GPS, I was still a quarter mile away, but there it was, cutting through the forest directly in front of me. I stepped onto the trail and looked around. I recognized the area. I was back at the hemlock grove, right at the spot where I'd seen the fork. But there was no fork, just the main trail continuing up the slope. I stood there, breathing hard, trying to understand what had just happened. I checked my GPS again, but the position had corrected itself. I was exactly where I should have been, 3 miles up from the trailhead, no deviation. I didn't go back to work that day. I hiked down to my truck, packed up my tools, and drove to the ranger station. I filed a report about the divergence, describing the fork and the meadow and the standing stone, and I marked the approximate location on the map. The ranger I spoke with listened politely and then pulled out the area survey maps. He showed me the section I'd been working and pointed out that there were no side trails, no meadows, and no geological features matching my description anywhere near the Colonel Bob Trail. He suggested that I might have gotten disoriented, maybe followed a game trail or a drainage without realizing it. I didn't argue. I just thanked him and left. I went back to the trail a week later with another worker this time. We hiked up to the hemlock grove together, and I showed him the spot where I'd seen the fork. There was nothing. No divergence, no second path, no sign that anything unusual had ever been there. We continued working the trail for the rest of the season, and I never saw the fork again, but I thought about it constantly, about the meadow and the stone and the way the path had disappeared, about the feeling I'd had standing in that circle of ferns, the sense that I'd stepped into a place that wasn't quite part of the forest I knew. I don't work for the Forest Service anymore. I moved to Eastern Washington a few years ago, took a job in drier country where the trees are smaller and the ground is harder, and you can see for miles in every direction. I tell people I wanted a change of scenery, and that's true. But the real reason is that I couldn't shake the feeling every time I walked into the Quinault Forest that the trails weren't fixed, that they could shift and change, and that if I stepped off the main path, I might not find my way back. The following case involves a photographer who went into the forest to capture the old growth and came away with something he wishes he'd never seen. I'm a freelance photographer, and I specialize in wilderness landscapes, the kind of work that ends up in magazines and galleries, big prints of remote places that most people will never visit. The Quinault Rain Forest had been on my list for years. I'd seen other photographers work from the area, and I knew it had the kind of conditions I was looking for. Deep greens, heavy atmosphere, ancient trees that photographed like monuments. I planned a 5-day trip in late November, figuring the fall colors would be past peak, but the winter storms wouldn't have fully set in yet. I had all my gear, a good camera, a sturdy tripod, and enough supplies to camp out near the trailheads and hike into the deeper sections during the day. The first 2 days went exactly as I'd hoped. I hiked into the Quinault River Valley and worked the areas around the Big Cedar and the Enchanted Valley trails, shooting in the early morning and late afternoon when the light was softest. The forest was incredible, mist hanging in the branches, moss covering everything, the sense of age and stillness that only comes from trees that have been standing for centuries. On the 3rd day, I decided to go deeper. I'd gotten permits to camp near the Colonel Bob trailhead, and I wanted to explore some of the unmaintained areas farther from the main paths. I packed light, just my camera, a couple of lenses, some water and food, and a GPS unit, and I started hiking into the old growth sections to the west of the trail. The terrain was rough, no paths, just open forest with thick undergrowth and deadfall everywhere. I moved slowly, picking my way between the massive trunks, stopping whenever I found a composition that worked. The light was perfect that day, pale and diffused, and the fog gave everything a dreamlike quality. I'd been hiking for maybe 2 hours when I found the clearing. It was small, maybe 20 feet across, and it was filled with ferns that had turned brown and gold with the season. In the center of the clearing was a tree stump, wide and flat, covered with moss. I walked over to it and set up my tripod, framing a shot of the stump with the surrounding trees towering in the background. I was adjusting the focus when I heard a sound behind me, a soft rustle like something moving through the ferns. I turned and saw it. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the trunk of a Sitka spruce. At first I thought it was a person, maybe another hiker, but then I realized the shape was wrong. Too tall, the limbs too long, the posture too rigid. It was watching me. I froze. My hands were still on the tripod, and I could feel my heart starting to pound. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, motionless. And I realized after a moment that it wasn't wearing clothes. Its skin, if that's what it was dark and textured, almost bark-like, and its face was elongated, featureless except for deep, hollow recesses where the eyes should have been. I don't know how long we stood there, staring at each other. It felt like minutes, but it might have only been a few seconds. And then, without thinking, I reached for my camera. I lifted it to my eye and framed the shot. The figure was still there, still motionless, and I fired off 3 quick frames before it moved. It stepped back behind the tree, and I heard the rustle of ferns again and then silence. I lowered the camera, my hands shaking. I looked at the screen, scrolling through the images I'd just taken. The first 2 frames were sharp, the clearing in focus, but the figure was blurred, just a dark smudge at the edge of the frame. The 3rd frame was different. The figure was clearer, standing fully visible, and the details were horrifying. The elongated limbs, the bark-like skin, the hollow eyes. It looked ancient, wrong, like something that had never been human. I packed up my gear as fast as I could and started moving. I didn't run, but I walked quickly, following my GPS back toward the trail. The forest felt different. Now, the silence was oppressive, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the figure following me. I made it back to the trail and then to my campsite by late afternoon. I didn't stop to shoot anything else. I packed up my tent and my gear and drove straight back to the ranger station. I didn't mention what I'd seen. I just asked if there were any reports of people living off-trail in that area, maybe squatters or hermits. The ranger told me no, that the forest was too dense and too wet for long-term habitation, and that they didn't get reports of unauthorized camping. I thanked him and left. That night, back in my motel room, I uploaded the images to my laptop. I went through them carefully, examining every frame. The 3 shots from the clearing were all there, but when I opened the 3rd frame, the one where the figure had been clearest, it was corrupted. The file wouldn't display properly, just a screen full of digital artifacts, pixelated blocks and glitched colors. I tried to recover it, running it through every piece of software I had, but the file was unsalvageable. The first 2 frames were intact, but the figure was too blurred to make out any detail. I kept shooting for the rest of the trip, but I didn't go back into the unmaintained areas. I stayed on the marked trails, worked quickly, and left a day earlier than I'd planned. When I got home, I went through all my gear. Everything was accounted for except my camera strap, which had somehow come loose and been left behind. I didn't realize it was missing until I unpacked everything, and by then it was too late to go back. I've never been able to explain what I saw in that clearing. I've told myself it was a person, maybe someone with a skin condition or wearing some kind of costume, but I don't believe that. The way it stood, the way it moved, the way it looked at me, it wasn't human, and the corrupted file bothers me. I've been a photographer for 15 years, and I've never had a file corrupt like that. Just one frame, the one frame that would have proven what I saw. I still have the 2 blurred images, but I've never shown them to anyone. I keep them on an external drive, backed up in 3 different locations, and sometimes I pull them up and stare at them, trying to make out the shape at the edge of the frame. I haven't been back to the Quinault. I've shot in other rainforests, other old-growth areas, but I stay on the trails now. I don't wander, and I don't photograph anything I can't immediately explain. The next report is from a logger who worked a salvage operation near the forest boundary and discovered that some trees are better left standing. I worked as a faller for a timber company out of Forks for almost 10 years. Not old growth, we didn't touch the protected areas, but second growth in salvage operations on private land near the forest boundaries. It was hard work, dangerous work, but it paid well and I liked being outside. In early December, we got contracted to clear a salvage site about 2 miles from the Quinault boundary. A windstorm had come through the previous winter and knocked down a bunch of trees on a private parcel, and the landowner wanted them removed before they became a fire hazard. It was a small job, maybe a week's work for a crew of 4. The site was accessible by a logging road that hadn't been used in a few years, overgrown and rutted, but passable with a 4-wheel drive. We set up a staging area near the road and started surveying the blowdown. Most of the trees were Douglas fir and hemlock, nothing unusual, and they were already starting to decay. We marked our cuts and started working. It was on the 2nd day that we found the tree. It was a Sitka spruce, massive, maybe 12 feet in diameter at the base. It hadn't been knocked down by the storm. It was still standing, but it was dead. The bark was blackened and cracked, and the branches were bare, skeletal. It looked like it had been struck by lightning, but there was no char, no obvious burn marks. The tree was right in the middle of the salvage area, and it was leaning slightly toward the road. We decided to drop it as part of the job, both for safety and to clear the space. I was the lead faller, so I made the first cut. I fired up my chainsaw and started the undercut, angling into the base of the trunk. The wood was strange, harder than it should have been, almost petrified, and the saw kicked back twice before I got a clean bite. As I cut deeper, I started to smell something. Not the usual resin and sawdust smell, but something else. Sour and organic, like rotting meat. I stopped and pulled the saw out, checking the cut. The wood inside was dark, almost black, and there was liquid seeping out of it. One of the other guys came over and looked at the cut. He said the tree might be rotten inside, that the liquid was probably just trapped moisture. But it didn't look like water. It was thick and dark, almost viscous, and the smell was getting stronger. We decided to finish the cut anyway. We made the back cut, driving wedges to control the fall, and the tree started to lean. It came down slowly, crashing through the undergrowth and hitting the ground with a sound like thunder. We walked over to inspect the trunk, and that's when we saw the cavity. The tree was hollow, not completely, but there was a large void running through the center of the trunk, maybe 3 feet wide and extending up into the heartwood. The walls of the cavity were smooth, almost polished, and they were covered with that same dark liquid. And there was something inside. It was hard to see at first, because the cavity was deep and the light was poor, but there was a shape in there. Something pale and folded, pressed up against the wood. One of the guys shined a flashlight into the cavity, and we all saw it at the same time. It looked like a body. Not a whole body, but pieces. Bones and what might have been skin compressed and compacted, like they'd been forced into the cavity under pressure. The smell was overwhelming, and I had to step back, covering my mouth. We called the foreman, and he called the county sheriff. It took them about 2 hours to reach the site, and by the time they arrived, we'd cordoned off the area and moved our equipment back. The deputies examined the cavity, and one of them climbed into the trunk with a camera to document what was inside. They pulled out 3 sets of remains. Not intact, not complete, but enough to identify them as human. The bones were old, weathered, and there was no soft tissue left, except for a few fragments. The sheriff's office launched an investigation, and the site was shut down for almost a month while they processed the scene. We never got a clear answer about what had happened. The remains were too degraded to identify, and there were no missing persons reports that matched the timeline. The leading theory was that the tree had grown around the remains, that someone had placed bodies in a natural cavity decades ago, and the tree had slowly enclosed them as it grew. But that didn't explain the smoothness of the cavity walls, or the way the bones had been compressed, or the liquid. The landowner abandoned the salvage operation. The site was left as it was, the blowdown still lying where it had fallen, and the county put up no trespassing signs along the road. I quit the job a few months later. I couldn't shake the image of that cavity, the way the bones had been folded and pressed into the wood. I kept thinking about the tree, about how long it had been standing there, about what it had been hiding. I've worked other logging sites since then, but I'm careful now about which trees I cut. If a tree looks wrong, if the bark is blackened or the wood smells strange, I walk away. I don't care what the foreman says. Some trees are better left standing. Another account, this time from a park volunteer who thought she understood the boundaries of her work until a night shift taught her otherwise. I volunteered at the Quinault Ranger Station for 2 seasons, mostly doing visitor services and helping with educational programs. It was part-time work, something I did in addition to my regular job, and I loved it. The forest was beautiful. The rangers were professional and knowledgeable, and I felt like I was contributing something meaningful. Most of my shifts were during the day, but occasionally I'd cover an evening or an overnight, especially during the busy summer months when the station stayed open late. The overnight shifts were quiet. Not many visitors, just the occasional late arrival, needing directions, or a camper checking in after hours. It was late October, a Thursday night, when I was asked to cover an overnight shift at the station. The ranger who was supposed to work had called in sick, and they needed someone to hold down the fort until the morning staff arrived. I agreed. It was easy work, mostly just sitting at the desk, monitoring the radio and answering the phone if it rang. The station is a small building, just a front desk and a couple of offices, with a bathroom and a storage room in the back. There's a large map on the wall behind the desk, showing the trails and roads and landmarks of the district, and a series of filing cabinets that hold visitor logs and incident reports. I arrived at the station around 8 in the evening, just as the last ranger was leaving. He gave me the rundown, told me to call if anything came up, and reminded me to lock the doors after the last visitor left. The station was supposed to close at 9, but I was authorized to stay until 6 in the morning, just in case someone needed assistance. The evening was uneventful. A couple of late hikers stopped by to ask about trail conditions, and a family checked in to confirm their campsite reservation. By 9:30, the station was empty, and I locked the front door and settled in at the desk with a book. The forest outside was very dark. There were no streetlights, no nearby buildings, just the station sitting alone at the edge of the trees. I could hear the rain starting, a soft patter on the roof, and the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. Around 11, I heard a knock on the door. I looked up, startled. I hadn't seen any headlights, hadn't heard a car pull up. I got up and walked to the door, peering through the window. There was a man standing on the porch, his back to me, facing the forest. I unlocked the door and opened it. The man didn't turn around. He just stood there, motionless, and I could see that he was soaked, his clothes dripping with rain. I asked if he needed help, and he turned slowly. His face was pale, his eyes unfocused, and he didn't say anything. He just stared at me. I asked again if he was okay, if he needed assistance or directions, and he finally spoke. His voice was quiet, flat, like he was reading from a script. He said he'd gotten lost, that he'd been hiking and had taken a wrong turn and couldn't find his way back to the trailhead. He asked if I could call someone to come pick him up. I invited him inside, out of the rain, and he stepped into the station. He stood just inside the door, water pooling around his boots, and I offered him a towel and a chair. He took the towel but didn't sit down. He just stood there, dripping, staring at the map on the wall. I asked which trail he'd been hiking, and he didn't answer. I asked where he'd parked, if he had a car nearby, and he shook his head slowly. I pulled out a map and tried to get him to show me where he'd been, but he wouldn't engage. He just kept staring at the big map on the wall, his eyes moving back and forth like he was reading something. I started to feel uneasy. There was something wrong with him, something off. His skin was too pale, his breathing too shallow, and he smelled strange. Not like sweat or dirt, but something else. Something organic and sweet, like decaying leaves. I excused myself and went to the back office, where the radio was, and I called the main ranger station. I told them I had a lost hiker at the desk who seemed disoriented and asked if they could send someone over. The dispatcher said they'd send a ranger, but it would take at least 30 minutes. When I came back to the front desk, the man was gone. I looked around the station, checking the bathroom and the storage room, but he wasn't there. The front door was still locked from the inside. I unlocked it and stepped onto the porch, looking out into the rain, but I didn't see anyone. No headlights, no movement, nothing. I went back inside and locked the door again. The towel I'd given him was still sitting on the desk, dry and folded like it had never been used. There was no water on the floor, no sign that anyone had been standing there dripping wet just a few minutes before. I sat down at the desk, my hands shaking, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. The man had been there. I'd seen him, spoken to him, handed him a towel, but there was no evidence, no trace. The ranger arrived about 40 minutes later. I told him what had happened, and he checked the station, inside and out, but he didn't find anything. He suggested that maybe the man had left while I was in the back office, that I might not have heard him unlock the door, but I knew that wasn't possible. The lock was old and loud, and I would have heard it. He filed a report and told me to call if anything else unusual happened. Then he left, and I was alone again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the shift. I sat at the desk with all the lights on, watching the door, listening to the rain. The station felt different now. The silence felt heavier, and I kept thinking I heard footsteps on the porch, or breathing just outside the window. When the morning staff arrived at 6, I handed over the keys and told them I needed to leave. I didn't go into detail about what had happened. I just said I wasn't feeling well. I never covered another overnight shift. I kept volunteering during the day for the rest of the season, but I made sure I was always gone by dusk. And I never saw the man again, never heard any reports of a lost hiker matching his description. But I still think about him, about the way he stood, dripping and silent, staring at the map, about the way he vanished, leaving no trace, and about the smell, that sweet decaying smell. that I can still remember if I think about it too hard. The following case comes from a hunter who went into the forest during deer season and found something that made him reconsider what he was actually tracking. I've been hunting the Olympics for over 20 years. Black-tailed deer mostly, sometimes elk if I draw a tag. I know the terrain, I know the game trails, and I know how to move through the forest without making noise. It's in my blood. My father hunted these mountains, and his father before him. The Quinault area has always been good for deer. The mix of old growth and open meadows creates good browse, and the population is healthy. I have a few spots I return to every season, places where I've had success before, and I know the patterns of the herds. It was mid-November, opening weekend of rifle season, and I'd hiked into one of my usual spots, a stretch of forest about 4 miles from the nearest road. I'd set up a small camp the night before, just a tarp and a sleeping bag, and I was up before dawn, moving quietly toward a ridge where I'd seen deer the previous year. The morning was cold and clear, the first clear day after a week of rain, and the forest was beautiful. Frost on the ferns, mist rising from the ground, the kind of conditions that make for good hunting. I was moving along a game trail, stepping carefully, when I saw the tracks. They were in the soft earth near a creek crossing, clear and fresh. But they weren't deer tracks. They weren't elk. They were humanoid, but wrong. Too long, too narrow, with deep impressions from what looked like clawed toes. I crouched down and examined them. The tracks were about 14 inches long, and they were spaced far apart, like whatever had made them had been moving with a long stride. The depth of the impressions suggested significant weight, more than a human, and the claw marks were deep, driven into the soil. I've seen bear tracks, cougar tracks, every kind of wildlife track in these mountains, and these didn't match anything I knew. I pulled out my phone and took a few photos, then stood and looked around. The tracks led deeper into the forest, following the creek upstream. I should have turned back, should have marked the location and reported it to Fish and Wildlife. But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know what had made the tracks, and I wanted to see it. I followed the trail for about a mile, moving slowly, keeping my rifle ready. The track stayed close to the creek, winding through the undergrowth occasionally, crossing back and forth over the water. At one point, I found a place where the creature had stopped, a depression in the moss where it might have rested or fed. There were more claw marks in the ground, deep gouges that looked deliberate. The forest started to change. The trees were older here, larger, and the undergrowth was thicker. The light was dimmer, even though it was mid-morning and the air felt colder. I started to hear sounds. Not animal sounds, but something else. A low rhythmic creaking, like wood bending under pressure. I stopped and listened. The creaking was coming from somewhere ahead, beyond a thick stand of hemlocks. I moved forward carefully, staying low, and when I reached the edge of the stand, I saw it. There was a clearing, maybe 30 feet across, and in the center was a structure. It wasn't a building, not exactly. It was made of branches and logs, stacked and woven together into a shape that was almost dome-like, about 10 feet tall and 15 feet wide. The structure looked old, the wood weathered and covered with moss, but it was clearly intentional, constructed with care, and the tracks led right to it. I stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the structure, and I realized the creaking sound was coming from it. The wood was moving slightly, shifting in the breeze, and I could see gaps between the branches where the interior was visible. I raised my rifle and scoped the structure, looking for movement. I didn't see anything, but I had the overwhelming sense that I was being watched. I backed away slowly, keeping the structure in sight. And when I was far enough into the trees, I turned and started moving quickly, back the way I'd come. I didn't run. I forced myself to stay calm, to keep my pace steady, but I could feel my heart pounding and my hands were shaking. I made it back to my camp and packed up as fast as I could. I didn't stop to eat or rest. I just loaded my gear and started hiking out. When I reached the road, I drove straight to the ranger station and told them what I'd found. I showed them the photos of the tracks, and I described the structure in the clearing. The ranger listened, made some notes, and told me they'd send someone to investigate. I never heard back from them. I called a few weeks later to follow up, and they told me they'd checked the area and hadn't found anything matching my description. No tracks, no structure, no evidence of unusual activity. I went back the following season, alone this time, and I tried to find the clearing. I hiked for 2 days, covering every section of forest near the creek, but I never found it. The game trail I'd followed was gone, and the terrain didn't match what I remembered. I still hunt the Olympics, but I don't go into that area anymore. I stay closer to the roads, closer to other hunters, and I don't follow tracks I can't identify. And I don't camp alone. Some things out there aren't meant to be hunted. The final account comes from a search and rescue volunteer who learned that not everyone who goes missing in the forest wants to be found. I've been volunteering with Olympic Mountain Rescue for almost 8 years. It's demanding work, physically and emotionally, but it's important. People get lost, people get hurt, and we're often the only thing standing between them and a very bad outcome. Most of our calls are routine. Hikers who've gone off trail and can't find their way back. Climbers who've gotten benighted. People who've underestimated the conditions. We go in, we find them, we bring them out. It's methodical, professional work. But there are cases that stay with you. Cases where the person you're looking for doesn't behave the way they should, where the evidence doesn't add up, where you come away feeling like you've missed something important. This was one of those cases. It was early December, and we got a call about a missing hiker in the Quinault area. A woman, late 30s, experienced outdoors, had gone for a day hike on the Graves Creek Trail and hadn't returned. Her car was still at the trailhead, and her family had reported her missing when she didn't come home that evening. We mobilized a team and headed out to the trailhead around midnight. The weather was poor, rain and wind, and the temperature was dropping. We knew we had a narrow window to find her before exposure became a serious concern. We split into 2 teams. One team took the main trail, moving fast and calling out, while my team worked a parallel route through the forest, searching for signs that she might have gone off trail. We had dogs with us, and they picked up a scent almost immediately, leading us away from the trail and into the old growth. The terrain was rough, thick undergrowth, deadfall everywhere, and the rain made everything slick and difficult. We moved slowly, following the dogs, calling her name, sweeping our lights across the forest. About 2 miles in, the dogs stopped. They were acting strange, whining and circling, refusing to move forward. The handler tried to encourage them, but they wouldn't budge. We decided to continue on foot, and the handler stayed with the dogs while the rest of us pushed ahead. We found her about 100 yards farther in. She was sitting at the base of a massive Sitka spruce, her back against the trunk, her arms wrapped around her knees. She was soaked, shivering, and when we shined our lights on her, she didn't react. Just sat there, staring straight ahead. I called out to her, identified myself as search and rescue, and told her we were there to help. She didn't respond. I approached slowly, kneeling down in front of her, and I could see that her eyes were open but unfocused. She was breathing, she was conscious, but she wasn't there. We wrapped her in an emergency blanket and tried to get her to stand, but she wouldn't move. She just kept staring at the tree, her lips moving slightly, like she was whispering something. One of the other team members leaned in close, trying to hear what she was saying, and after a moment, he pulled back and looked at me. He said she was counting. We finally managed to get her on her feet, and we started the long process of walking her out. She moved mechanically, like she was sleepwalking, and she never stopped whispering. The numbers just kept going, low and steady, and I realized after a while that she was counting backwards. By the time we reached the trailhead, she was down into the negative hundreds, and when we loaded her into the ambulance, she finally stopped. Just went silent, closed her eyes, and didn't say another word. I followed up with the family a few days later, and they told me she'd been released from the hospital. Physically, she was fine, just dehydrated and mildly hypothermic. But mentally, she wasn't the same. She wouldn't talk about what had happened, wouldn't explain why she'd gone off trail, or what she'd been doing sitting at the base of that tree. A few weeks later, I got a call from the family. They said she'd left a note and gone back to the forest. They wanted to know if we could search for her again, if we could bring her back. We organized another search covering the same area, but we didn't find her. No signs, no tracks, no evidence that she'd been there. The dogs wouldn't go past the same spot where they had stopped before, and after 3 days we called it off. She was never found. Her case is still open, listed as a missing person, but there haven't been any leads. No sightings, no reports, nothing. I think about her sometimes, about the way she sat there, staring at the tree, counting backwards like she was trying to reach zero, about the way the dogs refused to move forward, like they knew something we didn't, and about the note she left, which the family shared with me. It only said one thing: I have to finish. I don't know what she meant by that. I don't know what she was trying to finish, or what she thought was waiting for her in the forest. But I do know that I've stopped volunteering for searches in the Quinault. I still work with the team, still go out on calls, but if the location is anywhere near that old growth, I find a reason to stay back. Some people who go missing don't want to be found, and some things in the forest are better left alone. That's all we have for tonight from the Quinault Rain Forest. 8 accounts from people who went into those ancient trees for routine reasons and came back changed, if they came back at all. The forest is still there, still drawing visitors, still keeping its secrets beneath that endless canopy of green. If these stories have left you unsettled, remember that the darkest places aren't always the ones without light. Sometimes they're the ones where the light can't quite reach the ground, where the silence is too complete, and where the things that live in the shadows have been there far longer than we have. Thanks for listening to Blacktop Files. Stay safe out there.